1945. The world was on fire. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the war had reached a fever pitch, a brutal, no-holds-barred fight to the death. For American GIs, the Japanese were fanatics, emperor-worshipping zealots who'd rather die than surrender. For the Japanese, the Americans were the blue-eyed Oni, demons descending from the skies to incinerate their homes and families. In this cauldron of hatred, there was absolutely no room for compassion. You either killed or you were killed. But what if, deep in the heart of enemy territory, a single act of profound treason became the ultimate proof of humanity? Imagine, in the midst of this scene of terror, a soldier wounded in enemy territory, ending up in the home of a peasant family. What happened from then on will leave you astonished and even more faithful to humanity. The air inside the B-29 superfortress, nicknamed Heaven's Fury, was thick with a cocktail of sweat, oil, and pure, unadulterated fear. Lieutenant Marcus Thorne gripped the controls, his knuckles white. Below him, Japan was a patchwork of darkness, but he knew that darkness was alive, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, ready to tear them from the sky. This wasn't just another mission. It was a plunge into the very heart of the inferno, a place from which many never returned. "Flak at 2 o'clock, a voice crackled over the intercom, and then the sky erupted. Bursts of angry orange and black smoke blossomed around them, a deadly garden in the night. The plane bucked and shuddered, a beast being violently shaken. Marcus fought to keep her steady, his eyes darting across the instruments, his mind racing faster than the engines. Every explosion felt like a hammer blow against the thin aluminum skin, separating him from oblivion. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the engines. They were flying through a storm of steel, a man-made hell where survival was measured in inches and seconds. Below, the target was getting closer, a factory complex on the outskirts of Nagoya. The mission objective was simple, clinical: drop the payload, cripple the enemy's war machine. But up here, nothing was simple. Then it happened. Not a deafening boom, but a sickening, grinding tear of metal. A shell had found them. The world tilted violently as the portside wing erupted in flames. Alarms shrieked in protest, a chorus of mechanical death. The plane was dying, and it was taking them with it. We're hit bad," someone screamed, the panic slicing through the comms. Marcus wrestled with the yoke, his muscles straining against the dying hydraulics. The plane was in a flat spin, a graceful, terrifying ballet of destruction. He could see the ground rushing up to meet them, a dizzying spiral of dark greens and browns. The order came, sharp and desperate. "Bail out! Bail out!" It was every man for himself now. The brotherhood of the skies was shattered. He unbuckled, scrambling for the exit hatch. The wind roared, a physical force that tore at him, trying to suck him out into the cold, unforgiving night. He saw the faces of his crewmen for a split second, young, terrified faces, boys who should have been back home playing baseball. Then he was out, tumbling through the chaos, the burning wreckage of Heaven's Fury lighting his descent. The parachute deployed with a bone-jarring jolt, a sudden violent stop in his plummet. Suspended between a burning sky and an alien Earth, he watched the remnants of his plane smash into a distant mountainside in a brilliant, final fireball. He was alone, drifting down into the black heart of the enemy's homeland. His mind, numb with shock, could only form one coherent thought. It was a thought stripped of all hope, a stark and simple acknowledgement of his fate. He was an enemy airman, a demon from the sky, descending into a land that had every reason to want him dead. He saw the dark, imposing shapes of the mountains growing closer, the endless sea of trees ready to swallow him whole. This wasn't survival. This was just a slower way to die. But before we continue with Marcus Thorne's incredible story of survival against all odds, please take a moment to support our channel. If you believe these hidden stories of courage and humanity deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button to ensure you never miss an episode. Give this video a like and let us know in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Consciousness returned to Marcus in fractured shards of pain, a throbbing agony in his leg, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, and the damp, earthy smell of the forest floor. He was tangled in the silk of his parachute, draped over the branches of a pine tree like a broken doll. The sun was filtering through the canopy, casting dappled light on his predicament. He was alive, but for how long? He managed to cut himself free, his body screaming in protest as he crashed the last few feet to the ground. His ankle was shattered, a grotesque angle that sent waves of nausea through him. He was disoriented, weaponless, and utterly alone in a sea of hostile wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. They would be looking for him. It wasn't soldiers who found him. It was an old man named Kenji, his back bent from a lifetime of toil in the rice paddies, and his young adult daughter, Hana. They had been foraging for mushrooms when they stumbled upon the wreckage of his parachute. They froze, their eyes widening first in confusion and then in a deep instinctual fear. Before them was not a man, but a monster from the propaganda posters. To them, Marcus was the Oni. His blonde hair, a shocking color in rural Japan, seemed unnatural. His blue eyes were the color of the sky from which death rained down. He was tall, a giant compared to them, and even in his broken state, he radiated an aura of the enemy, the foreign devil who had brought fire and destruction to their nation. Hana instinctively pulled her father back. Their first reaction was a silent, frantic debate communicated through terrified glances. The law was clear. The military police, the dreaded Kempeitai, had decreed that any enemy airman found was to be reported immediately. To aid him was treason. To kill him on sight was a patriotic duty. Kenji's hand rested on the small sickle he carried at his belt, his knuckles tight. Marcus saw the fear and hatred in their eyes. He tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. He raised a hand, a universal gesture of peace, but it only seemed to heighten their alarm. He was at their mercy, completely and totally. He was the personification of a war that had ravaged their lives, a symbol of the enemy that had taken the lives of their countrymen, perhaps even their own family. He could see the internal struggle on the old man's face. It was a conflict as old as time itself, the duty to one's tribe versus the innate compassion for a suffering creature. Hana whispered frantically to her father, her words a torrent of panicked Japanese that Marcus couldn't understand. She was pleading, but for what? To run, to fetch soldiers, or to kill him where he lay? Kenji looked from the American's pain-filled eyes to his daughter's frightened face. He had seen enough death. He had heard the radio broadcasts detailing the horrors of the firebombings in Tokyo. This man was part of that. And yet, here on the forest floor, he was just a boy, bleeding and broken miles from his home. He wasn't a demon anymore. He was just a human being. The old farmer slowly lowered his hand from his sickle. It was a small gesture, but it was the most significant decision of his entire life. He looked at Hana, a quiet resolve hardening his features. He said something to her in a low, firm voice. She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and terror at what he was suggesting. The choice was being made. They weren't going to kill him, and they weren't going to turn him in. They were going to do something far more dangerous, something that flew in the face of years of propaganda, national duty, and self-preservation. They were going to help him. And in that moment, the fates of this American pilot and this Japanese farming family became inextricably and perilously intertwined. That night, under the flickering light of a single oil lamp, the family's small farmhouse became a chamber of secrets. Kenji, Hana, and her two young children, Ken and Yumi, gathered around the hearth. The wounded American, Marcus, lay on a futon in the corner, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep. The air was thick with unspoken fear. They were committing a capital crime. "What have you done, father?" Hana whispered, her voice trembling. "They will kill us. The Kempeitai will show no mercy." She wasn't wrong. The Japanese secret police were infamous for their brutality. Harboring an enemy pilot wasn't just treason, it was an invitation for torture and public execution. A stain of shame that would follow their family for generations. Their neighbors would spit on their graves. Kenji looked at his daughter, his face etched with the deep lines of a hard life. "And what would they do to him?" he asked quietly. "He is a soldier, yes, but he is also someone's son. To hand him over is to deliver him to a butcher. I have seen enough killing. I will not have another man's blood on my hands, even an enemy's." The debate was a gut-wrenching tug-of-war between survival and morality. Every argument for self-preservation was met with the stark reality of the man sleeping in their home. They could take him to the edge of the village and leave him. They could claim they never saw him, but they knew deep down that would be a lie they could never live with. His ghost would haunt their home forever. Hana thought of her own husband, a soldier fighting somewhere in Manchuria, a man she hadn't heard from in over a year. What if he were in this same situation, wounded, alone in a foreign land? Wouldn't she pray that some stranger, even an enemy, might show him a moment of kindness? The thought was a painful splinter in her heart. The risks were astronomical. Discovery didn't just mean their own deaths. It could bring ruin upon the entire village. The military might decide the whole community was complicit, a nest of traitors. Homes could be burned, neighbors interrogated. Their single act of compassion could unleash a firestorm of collective punishment. They were gambling with the lives of everyone they had ever known. Little Ken, no older than 7, crept over to look at the sleeping American. He had heard the stories at school about the long-nosed demons, but this man just looked hurt. He saw the grime on his face, the way his brow furrowed in pain even in sleep. There was nothing demonic about him. He was just a man. Finally, the decision settled upon them, not with a bang, but with a heavy, resigned silence. It was a choice born not of politics or patriotism, but of a fundamental shared humanity that the war had tried so hard to extinguish. Kenji looked at his family, his gaze firm. "He is a human being," he stated, as if it were the only fact that mattered in the whole world. "And under our roof," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of an oath. "He is not the enemy. He is a guest." The words hung in the air, sealing their fate. From that moment on, their lives would be a lie. Every day would be a performance, every knock at the door a potential death sentence. They had chosen the path of compassion, a treacherous road in a world consumed by hate. They didn't know if they were strong enough to see it through, or what the ultimate cost would be. All they knew was that they had crossed a line. They were no longer just farmers, they were conspirators, they were traitors, and they were Marcus Thorne's only hope. The first order of business was to make the ghost disappear. With Marcus's fever breaking, Kenji knew he couldn't stay in the open. A simple search would reveal him instantly. The solution was as old as fear itself: go to ground. Beneath the main room of the farmhouse was a small root cellar, a dark, cramped space for storing potatoes and pickled vegetables through the winter. This was to be Marcus's new world. They pried up the floorboards near the hearth, the aging wood groaning in protest. The space below was barely large enough for a man to lie down, smelling of damp earth and decay. For Marcus, his leg crudely splintered by Kenji, it was a tomb. For the family, it was a sanctuary, the only place where their terrible secret could be kept safe from prying eyes. Those first few months were a living nightmare of unrelenting tension. Life became a series of coded signals and hushed movements. Marcus learned the rhythm of the house from below, the soft padding of Hana's feet in the morning, the heavier tread of Kenji returning from the fields, the light scampering of the children. These sounds were his only connection to the world, his only proof that he wasn't buried alive. Every unexpected noise from the village was a shot of ice through their veins. the bark of a dog, a cart rattling down the path, a neighbor calling out a greeting. Each one could be the prelude to discovery. When someone came to the door, the family would freeze, their conversations halting mid-sentence, their hearts hammering in unison as they prayed the visitor wouldn't stay long. The children, Ken and Yumi, had to be taught the most difficult lesson of their young lives: silence. They couldn't speak of the man under the floor. They couldn't whisper about him to their friends. Their home, once a place of simple, open childhood, was now governed by a secret so immense and dangerous that a single slip of the tongue could get them all killed. Down in the darkness, Marcus struggled to keep his sanity. The endless hours were a breeding ground for despair. He would trace the patterns in the wood grain above him, count the drips of condensation on the earthen walls, anything to keep his mind from spiraling. He was a prisoner, not of the enemy, but of the very people who were risking everything to save him. Hannah would bring him food when it was safe, usually late at night. She would lift the floorboard, her face silhouetted by a candle, and pass down a small bowl of rice or a piece of fish. Their exchanges were silent, just a quick, furtive passing of sustenance. But in her eyes, Marcus saw not hatred, but a deep, sorrowful fear, a fear for him and a fear for her family. The psychological toll was immense for everyone. The family was living on a knife's edge, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. They had to maintain a facade of complete normalcy for the outside world, smiling at the very neighbors who would be the first to report them if they knew the truth. Every day was a performance, and the stage was their own home. For Marcus, the isolation was a unique form of torture. He was so close to life, yet completely cut off from it. He could hear the laughter of the children playing just a few feet above his head, a sound that was both a comfort and a painful reminder of the world he had lost. He was a phantom, haunting his own life, a secret buried under the floorboards. They were all trapped together in this conspiracy of kindness: the farmer, the daughter, the children, and the enemy pilot in his earthen cell. The constant, gnawing fear became the new normal, a permanent resident in their home. They were bound by a secret that was both preserving a life and slowly eroding their own. In the beginning, the chasm between them felt as wide as the Pacific Ocean. Marcus was the enemy incarnate, and the family couldn't shake the years of indoctrination. When Hannah brought him his meager meals, she would avoid his gaze, her movements quick and robotic. She was feeding a man, but in her mind, she was also feeding the war machine that sought to destroy her country. Communication was a frustrating pantomime. A pointed finger and a questioning look for water, a hand on the stomach to signify hunger, a thumbs up, a gesture Marcus soon learned was not universal, to show his gratitude. Their interactions were clipped, functional, and steeped in a profound sense of mutual distrust. He was a threat. They were his jailers, albeit benevolent ones. Marcus, for his part, was battling his own demons. This family represented the Japs he'd been trained to dehumanize and kill without a second thought. He remembered the briefing rooms, the posters of snarling, buck-toothed caricatures. But the reality was this: a stoic old man with calloused hands and a terrified young woman who showed him a quiet, reluctant kindness. He watched them through the cracks in the floorboards when they thought he was asleep. He saw Kenji painstakingly mending a tool, his brow furrowed in concentration. He saw Hana patiently teaching her daughter, Yumi, how to sew. He heard their soft-spoken conversations, the gentle cadence of their language. These were not the actions of fanatics or monsters. They were just people. The turning point was a small, almost insignificant event. One night, a rat scurried across Marcus's hiding space. Startled, he let out a muffled cry and banged his injured leg against the wall. Above, he heard a sudden silence, then frantic whispering. A moment later, the floorboard lifted. It was Hana holding a small wooden club, her face pale but determined. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid for him. That simple act of protection, of shared vulnerability against a common pest, began to chip away at the walls between them. She started to linger for a moment after dropping off his food, making a gesture to his leg and raising her eyebrows in a silent question. He would nod or shake his head. It was a start, a fragile bridge being built across a vast divide. He began to learn their faces, the nuances of their expressions. He could tell when Kenji was worried about the crops by the set of his jaw. He could hear the exhaustion in Hana's sighs late at night. Their lives, once an abstract concept of the enemy, were becoming real and tangible to him. He was a witness to their daily struggles, their fears, their small joys. The family, too, began to see past the uniform and the foreign features. They saw the way Marcus's eyes lit up when young Yumi would hum a children's song. They saw the shame and frustration on his face when he struggled with his immobility. The label of American pilot was slowly being replaced by a more complex human identity. He was still their prisoner, and they were still his captors. The dynamic was fraught with the tension of their situation, but a subtle shift was occurring. He was no longer just a secret to be kept or a problem to be managed. He was becoming a person, a presence in their home, albeit an invisible one. The line between enemy and guest was beginning to blur. The question lingered in the quiet moments, for both Marcus and the family. Who was he really? And who were they? The war had given them simple, hateful answers. But here, in the forced intimacy of their shared secret, those answers were falling apart, leaving only a complicated, dangerous, and undeniably human connection in their place. The true architects of peace, it turned out, were the children. For 7-year-old Ken and 5-year-old Yumi, the war was an abstract concept, a story told by adults. The man under the floor, however, was a concrete and fascinating mystery. They didn't see an enemy combatant. They saw a hidden, secret friend, a figure of immense intrigue living right beneath their feet. Their natural childhood curiosity couldn't be contained by their mother's stern warnings. They began to invent excuses to be near the hearth, to drop small things through the cracks in the floorboards. A shiny pebble, a wild berry, a carefully folded paper crane. These were their secret offerings, their tiny acts of diplomacy in a world gone mad with hatred. Marcus, starving for any human connection beyond the furtive nightly visits, cherished these small gifts like treasure. He would wait for the sound of their small feet, his heart lifting at their innocent conspiracies. They were a lifeline, a reminder of a world where people weren't defined by the flag on their uniform. He started leaving things for them in return, a button from his flight suit, a small carving made with a dull stone. One evening, Hana was changing the dressing on Marcus's leg, a task that had become a silent, accepted ritual. Little Yumi crept close, her eyes wide. Pointing a small finger at the tall American, she uttered a single clear word she had learned for a visiting relative. Oji-san, uncle. The word hung in the air, a shocking, innocent reframing of their entire reality. Hina gasped, quickly shushing her daughter, but the name stuck. Marcus, understanding the meaning from the context and the tenderness in the child's voice, felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with his lingering fever. He was no longer the fallen demon or the enemy pilot. In the eyes of a child, he was family. He became Makasu Oji-san, Uncle Marcus. The children became his teachers. They would lie on the floor and whisper Japanese words through the cracks. Mizu, Ken would say, holding up a cup of water. Gohan, Yumi would chirp, pointing to a bowl of rice. Marcus, a clumsy student, would repeat the words back, his accent thick and strange, sending the children into fits of suppressed giggles. Through them, he learned the words for family. Otu-san, father. Oka-san, mother. He began to piece together the fabric of their lives, not just through observation, but through language. This simple act of learning their tongue was an act of profound respect, an acknowledgement that he was in their world, living by their grace. The transformation was astonishing. The presence of Uncle Marcus under the floor became the children's great adventure. They were the guardians of a magnificent secret. They would report on village happenings in hushed tones, warning him if a patrol was near, their small faces serious with the gravity of their mission. They were his lookouts, his little soldiers in a private, silent war. For Kenji and Hana, watching this bond form was both heart-wrenching and terrifying. It humanized Marcus completely, making their decision to protect him feel undeniably right. But it also raised the stakes. It was one thing to hide an enemy. It was another thing entirely to hide a beloved uncle. Their emotional attachment was growing, making the danger feel even more acute. The greatest barrier, the dehumanizing hatred of war, had been effortlessly dismantled by the innocence of children. They didn't understand geopolitics or military strategy. They only understood kindness and curiosity. By naming him Uncle, they had welcomed him into their family, an act of love that was also the most dangerous kind of treason. As Marcus's leg slowly healed from a painful fracture into a manageable limp, the confinement of the cellar began to eat away at his spirit. Lying in the dark day after day was a form of madness. He needed to move, to do something, to feel useful. He was a man of action, a pilot, and the forced inertia was as much a prison as the 4 earthen walls around him. He began to plead with Kenji in his broken, halting Japanese, mixed with desperate gestures. He pointed to his own hands, then mimed the act of farming, of lifting, of working. "Help," he would say. "Tetsudao." He wanted to contribute, to repay their kindness in the only way he could. He couldn't bear being a mere burden, a secret consumer of their precious, rationed food. Kenji was hesitant. The risk was enormous. Bringing Marcus out of the cellar, even in the dead of night, was a gamble of epic proportions. A single person awake at the wrong time, a neighbor with insomnia, a passing soldier. Any of it could spell their doom. But he also saw the desperation in the young man's eyes, the need for purpose that was wasting away in the dark. And so, a new, even more dangerous routine began. Long after the last light in the village had been extinguished, under the cover of a moonless sky, Marcus would emerge from his hiding place. His first steps into the cool night air felt like a rebirth. He stretched his cramped limbs, breathing in the scent of the fields, a free man for a few precious hours. Kenji began to teach him the ancient rhythms of the land. He showed Marcus how to mend a broken fence with practiced, efficient movements. He taught him how to sharpen a hoe, the precise angle needed for the blade to bite into the soil. For Marcus, whose hands were trained for the complex machinery of a bomber, this simple earthy work was a revelation. It was a bizarre and profound role reversal. The hands that had, just months before, gripped the controls to release thousands of pounds of explosives over Japanese cities were now learning to cultivate Japanese soil. He plunged his hands into the dirt, feeling the life within it. He was no longer destroying, he was nurturing. The irony was a heavy weight in his soul. He learned to see the back-breaking labor that went into every single bowl of rice he ate. He saw the sweat on Kenji's brow as they worked side by side in the whispering darkness. This wasn't an abstract enemy homeland. It was a real place, a farm, a family's livelihood that they defended with aching muscles and ceaseless toil. The concept of the enemy was becoming utterly meaningless. Working together, they built a new kind of communication, a language of shared tasks that needed no words. A nod to pass a tool, a grunt of effort as they lifted a heavy stone, a shared glance at the eastern sky, warning of the approaching dawn. In the silent collaboration of the night, the old farmer and the young pilot forged a bond of mutual respect. These nocturnal labors became Marcus's salvation. They kept his body strong and his mind occupied. More importantly, they allowed him to feel like he was earning his keep, that he was part of the family's struggle for survival, not just the cause of it. He was contributing to the very life he had been sent to disrupt. As he drove a post into the ground or cleared a ditch, Marcus Thorne, the American airman, began to fade. In his place was just a man, working alongside another man, both of them bound by the earth and a shared, perilous secret. The hands that were trained for war were being retaught the work of peace, one clandestine night at a time. In a small, tightly knit community like theirs, secrets were a luxury few could afford. Every family's business was, to some extent, the village's business. And for some time, Saito, the family's next-door neighbor, had been feeling that something was off with the Kenji household. Saito was a man whose patriotism burned with a feverish intensity, a fervent believer in the divinity of the emperor and the glory of the Japanese war effort. It started with small things, inconsistencies that gnawed at him. He noticed that Hana seemed to be buying slightly more rice at the village store than a small family would need, especially with rationing in full effect. He saw the flicker of a light in their home at odd hours of the night. Most of all, he saw a new, hunted look in their eyes, a constant, weary vigilance. Saito had lost a son in the Battle of Okinawa. His grief had curdled into a bitter, suspicious hatred for the enemy and anyone who wasn't fully committed to their eradication. He saw potential traitors everywhere. He began to watch Kenji's family with a hawk's eye, his suspicion growing from a vague unease into a full-blown obsession. He would casually stop by, making small talk about the war or the harvest, but his eyes would be scanning, searching for anything out of place. He'd ask pointed questions. "You all seem tired lately, Hana-san. Are you sleeping well?" His inquiries were veiled accusations, each one a small probe designed to puncture their fragile composure. The family felt his scrutiny like a physical weight. They had to be more careful than ever. Conversations became even more hushed. Marcus was confined to the cellar around the clock, the nocturnal farm work suspended indefinitely. The friendly waves from their neighbor now felt like threats. The danger was no longer an abstract concept of military patrols. It was a man who lived 20 yards away. One afternoon, Saito's grandson kicked a ball over the fence into Kenji's yard. When Saito came to retrieve it, he lingered by the side of the house near the small vent that led to the root cellar. For one heart-stopping moment, his eyes narrowed. Had he heard something? A cough? A shifting of weight? The family watched from the window, their blood running cold. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Hana started having nightmares of the Kempeitai, dragging her father and children away. Kenji grew gaunt, the strain aging him years in a matter of weeks. They were trapped between their conscience, which demanded they protect Marcus, and the growing certainty that their neighbor was closing in on their secret. Saito, convinced he was on the verge of uncovering a great betrayal, escalated his campaign. He began speaking to other villagers, planting seeds of doubt. "Kenji seems different since the American plane went down," he would muse aloud. "He's not as patriotic as he once was. He was turning the community against them, isolating them with rumor and innuendo. The enemy was no longer a faceless American in a bomber. The most immediate and terrifying threat to their lives was one of their own people, a man they had known for decades, a neighbor whose grief had twisted him into an instrument of the state's most paranoid fantasies. The walls weren't just in their home anymore. They were closing in from all sides. They were completely isolated. They couldn't confide in anyone. They couldn't fight back against Saito's suspicions without revealing why he was suspicious in the first place. Their act of humanity had put them on an island, and the tide of their neighbors' fanaticism was rising, threatening to drown them all. The news arrived like a death knell, delivered by the village headman with a grim face. The Kempeitai were coming. A sweeping inspection of the entire region was underway, a search for draft dodgers, deserters, and, most ominously, any downed Allied airmen. They would be searching every house, top to bottom, no exceptions. They were expected in 2 days. Panic, cold, and absolute seized the family. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide Marcus. The forest was too vast, and his leg was still too weak for a long journey. The secret police were meticulous and brutal. They would find the hidden cellar. It was over. They huddled together in the main room, the unspoken truth hanging between them. discovery meant torture for Marcus and a swift, dishonorable execution for all of them. It was Kenji, his face a mask of desperate concentration, who remembered an old story, a tale of a family who had avoided a tax collector by faking a cholera outbreak. It was a wild, insane long shot, but it was the only shot they had. He rose, his movements stiff with resolve. "I'm going to see the monk at the temple," he announced, leaving no room for argument. The local Buddhist monk, a wise and compassionate man who had long preached peace over the jingoism of the military, was their only possible ally. Kenji laid the entire desperate truth before him. The monk listened, his eyes closed in deep meditation. Aiding them would make him a traitor as well. After a long, agonizing silence, he nodded once. "A death in the family is a tragic thing," he said cryptically. "It must be respected." The plan was born of sheer audacious desperation. They would stage a funeral. With the monk's collusion, they would announce that a distant cousin who had been staying with them had suddenly succumbed to a highly contagious and deadly disease. Tuberculosis was the chosen ailment. The fear of contagion, they prayed, would be even more powerful than the authority of the Kempe Tai. The next 24 hours were a frantic, surreal blur of activity. Hana and Kenji, their faces streaked with a mixture of real and feigned tears, informed the village headman of their tragedy. The monk prepared a death certificate and hung quarantine notices. Neighbors, including a secretly gleeful Saito, offered condolences from a safe distance, no one daring to come too close to the infected house. The most harrowing role fell to Marcus. He had to play the part of the corpse. They wrapped him in a white funeral shroud, leaving a small opening for air, and laid him on a plank in the center of the main room, surrounded by incense and offerings. He had to lie perfectly still for hours, listening to the sounds of his own staged mourning. When the Kempetai officers arrived, their polished boots echoing on the path, the family's performance reached its climax. Hana met them at the door, her face a convincing mask of profound grief and fear. She begged them not to enter, to not risk catching the disease. "My cousin, he died so quickly," she sobbed, pointing a trembling finger toward the shrouded figure inside. The officers, arrogant and fearsome men, were clearly disgusted. The last thing they wanted was to contract a fatal illness in some backwater village. They peered inside from the doorway, wrinkling their noses at the smell of incense and sickness. They saw the grieving family, the body, the official quarantine notices from the temple. It was enough. They barked a few questions, then turned and left. Lying in his shroud, Marcus had listened to every word, his heart threatening to beat its way out of his chest. The sound of the officers' retreating footsteps was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. The family had done it. Their insane, desperate gamble had paid off. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had blinked first. August 15th, 1945. The air in the village was thick and humid, heavy with the oppressive heat of late summer. A strange energy crackled through the community. Everyone had been ordered to gather around a radio to listen to a broadcast from the emperor himself. It was unprecedented. The emperor was considered a living god. His voice had never been heard by the common people. Genji's family, along with Marcus listening from his hiding spot, huddled around their small, crackling radio set. Then it came. A high-pitched formal voice that seemed to belong to another age. It was the Gyokwon Hoso, the dual voice broadcast. Though the language was archaic and difficult to understand, the message was unmistakable. Japan had endured the unendurable. Japan was surrendering. The war was over. A profound, bewildered silence fell over the room, and indeed over the entire nation. There were no cheers of relief, no cries of victory. There was only a deep, collective shock, a sense of a world turned upside down. The foundation of their reality, the belief in divine victory, in the indomitable spirit of Japan, had crumbled into dust in the space of a few minutes. For the family, the news brought not celebration, but a new and complicated wave of uncertainty. The war was over, yes, but what did that actually mean for them? For Marcus, The infrastructure of the country was shattered. Who was in charge? Would American soldiers come flooding into their village? Was it safe for Marcus to suddenly appear? The end of the war didn't magically erase the last few years. In the eyes of their neighbors, particularly Saito, Marcus was still the enemy, the demon who had bombed their country into submission. Revealing him now might not lead to a military execution, but it could easily incite a mob, a vengeful act of justice carried out by people whose world had just been destroyed. Inside Marcus, a storm of emotions raged. Relief, so overwhelming it almost made him sick, battled with a strange sense of sorrow. He should have been euphoric. He had survived. He was going to go home, but his survival was inextricably linked to this family. The end of the war meant the end of their time together, the end of this strange, intense, secret life they had built. The days that followed were tense and quiet. The structure of war, for all its horrors, had provided a strange kind of order. Now there was a vacuum. No one knew what to do. The family continued their routine, hiding Marcus, protecting their secret because it was all they knew. The world outside had changed irrevocably, but inside the small farmhouse, nothing had. They had become a single, inseparable unit, bound by a shared secret and a shared struggle. The end of the war didn't sever that bond. In many ways, it made it more poignant. They were no longer united against a common enemy like the Kempitai. They were just a family facing an unknown future together. There was no clear path forward. If American troops arrived, how would they explain Marcus? How could they explain what they had done? They had committed treason to save a man's life, but in the chaotic aftermath of total defeat, it was impossible to know whether that act would be seen as one of heroism or of unforgivable betrayal. And so they waited. The declaration of peace had arrived not with a triumphant fanfare, but with the sound of silence. A silence filled with questions, with fear, and with the dawning realization that even though the war was over, their own personal battle was far from finished. The most difficult chapter was yet to come. Weeks turned into a month. The autumn harvest began. Then one day, a rumbling sound echoed through the valley, a sound the villagers hadn't heard before. It was the sound of American trucks. A platoon of U.S. soldiers, part of the occupation force, was making its way through the remote countryside, securing the area and cataloging resources. For Marcus and his adopted family, the moment of truth had arrived. Marcus, clean-shaven for the first time in months and wearing a set of Kenji's old, ill-fitting clothes, walked out of the farmhouse and into the sunlight with the family by his side. He approached the American patrol, his heart a confusing mix of elation and profound sadness. The young GIs stared in disbelief at the sight of a fellow American, gaunt but alive, emerging from a tiny Japanese farmhouse. The reunion with his countrymen was loud and joyous. They clapped him on the back, offered him cigarettes and chocolate, and bombarded him with questions. He was a hero, a man who had survived behind enemy lines. But as he answered their questions, he found himself constantly looking back at the small family standing by the farmhouse, their faces etched with a quiet, heartbreaking sorrow. The time to leave came all too quickly. A jeep was waiting to take him to a nearby base, the first step on his long journey home. The departure was not the triumphant rescue of a POW. It was the gut-wrenching farewell of a son leaving his family. There were no grand speeches, just a silence thick with everything that could not be said. He turned to Kenji, the old farmer who had become a father to him. He bowed deeply, the Japanese gesture of ultimate respect he had learned, and said, "Arigatou gozaimasu." Thank you. The words felt laughably inadequate. How do you thank someone for your life? Kenji simply placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Hana stood back, holding her children close. She handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a rice ball for his journey. It was a simple, motherly gesture that shattered what little composure Marcus had left. He looked at this woman who had risked everything, who had fed him and cared for him, and saw the true face of courage. The hardest part was saying goodbye to the children. Little Yumi and Ken couldn't understand. Why was Makasu Oji-san leaving? He was their secret, their friend, their uncle. Yumi tugged on his trousers, her face crumpled in confusion, asking him not to go. He knelt down, his vision blurring with tears, and hugged them tightly, whispering a promise in English that he would never, ever forget them. As he climbed into the jeep, he looked back one last time. The four of them stood there, a small, solitary family silhouetted against their humble home, growing smaller and smaller as the vehicle drove away. They weren't his captors or his saviors. They were his family, and he was leaving them behind. The soldiers in the jeep were celebrating, whooping about the war being over and going home. But Marcus was silent, his heart aching with a sense of loss that was as profound as any grief he had ever known. He was saved, but he felt like he had just abandoned the most important people in his life. He was going home, back to the world he belonged to, but a significant part of his soul would forever remain in that small village, in a farmhouse where a family had committed an act of treasonous love, proving that humanity could blossom in the most barren of landscapes. The goodbye was not an ending, it was a wound that he would carry for the rest of his life. Marcus Thorne returned to America a hero. His story was incredible, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Newspapers ran articles about the pilot who survived a crash and evaded capture for months in the Japanese wilderness. He was awarded a medal, given a parade in his small Ohio hometown, and slapped on the back by everyone he met. But it all felt hollow, a celebration of a story they didn't truly understand. To his friends and family, he had endured the enemy hell. They spoke of the Japanese in harsh, unforgiving terms, savages, fanatics who would have tortured him without a second thought. They praised his luck for having escaped their clutches. Marcus would just nod, a pit forming in his stomach. He couldn't bring himself to correct them, to explain the truth. How could he? How could he describe the quiet dignity of Kenji, or the fierce, protective love in Hana's eyes? How could he explain that the enemy hell had been a place of profound kindness, a sanctuary that had saved not just his body, but his soul? To tell the truth would be to betray the very people who had honored him. His countrymen wouldn't understand. They would call Kenji's family traitors to their own cause. He was a man caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. In America, he was a war hero, but he felt like a fraud. He was haunted by the memory of the family he had left behind, consumed by a gnawing guilt. He had simply walked away, back to his life of comfort and freedom, while they were left to face the consequences of their actions, whatever they might be. He suffered from a deep sense of displacement. The familiar sights and sounds of home felt alien to him. The casual hatred still directed at the Japanese in the post-war years felt like a personal insult. He would sit at the dinner table, listening to his father talk about the Japs, and feel a silent, burning rage. He was a stranger in his own home. He tried to move on. He got a job, started dating, attempted to piece together the life that the war had interrupted. But the past was a constant companion. He would wake up in the middle of the night, the Japanese words for father and mother on his lips. He would see a child in the street and be instantly transported back to Ken and Yumi. His experience had fundamentally changed him. He had seen the war not from 15,000 feet as a series of abstract targets, but from the ground, in the faces of the people it affected. He had learned that the line between us and them was a fiction, a convenient lie told to make killing easier. He carried this truth like a secret burden. People remarked that Marcus was different now, quieter, more distant. They attributed it to the trauma of war, to what we now call PTSD. And they were right, but not in the way they thought. His trauma wasn't just about the crash or the fear of being caught. It was the trauma of a profound and unresolved debt, a feeling of being eternally indebted to people he might never see again. He was home, but he was not whole. He had survived the war, but he had lost his sense of place in the world. He was a ghost, haunted not by the enemies he had fought, but by the enemies who had shown him a grace and humanity that put his own side to shame. His body was back in Ohio, but his heart, his conscience, and his soul were still thousands of miles away, in a small farmhouse under the shadow of a Japanese mountain, with the family who had redefined the meaning of the word enemy for him forever. Years tumbled by, each one piling on top of the last. The world moved on. America boomed with post-war prosperity. The Cold War cast a new, long shadow across the globe. Japan, once the bitter enemy, was slowly being rebuilt into a modern nation and a key American ally. But for Marcus Thorne, time did nothing to dull the memory or lessen the weight of his debt. He lived a seemingly normal life. He married a kind woman, had children of his own, and built a successful career as an architect. But beneath the surface of this conventional American life, the promise he made to himself, the silent vow to one day return, was a constant burning ember. He never spoke of it, but it guided his every major decision. He began to save money, putting a small amount aside every month into a separate account he labeled simply KF for Kenji's family. It was his pilgrimage fund. While his friends bought new cars and boats, Marcus squirreled away his earnings for a journey back to a past that no one else knew he had. He also began to study. He took night classes in Japanese language and culture, moving beyond the simple, childlike vocabulary he had learned under the floorboards. He wanted to return, not as the ignorant American boy they had saved, but as a man who could properly express the gratitude that had been lodged in his throat for decades. His family and friends found his obsession with Japan peculiar. "Why are you so interested in that place, Mark?" they would ask. After what they put you through, he would just offer a vague smile and say he found the culture fascinating. The truth was too complex, too personal to ever share. It was a sacred part of his history. As the years passed, the mission became more urgent. Kenji would be an old man now, if he was even still alive. Hana would be a grandmother. The children, Ken and Yumi, would be adults with families of their own. The fear that he might be too late, that he might never get the chance to thank them, began to gnaw at him. Finally, in the late 1960s, more than 2 decades after he had been flown out of Japan, he decided it was time. His children were grown. He had saved enough money. He told his wife the whole story for the first time, pouring out the secret he had carried alone for so long. She listened, her eyes filled with tears, and simply said, "You have to go." The journey was a daunting prospect. He had no address, only the name of a tiny village in a mountainous region that had likely changed beyond recognition. He had no idea if they would even remember him or if they would want to. Perhaps his reappearance would only open old wounds, reminding them of a dangerous time they would rather forget. But the pull of the past was stronger than any fear of the future. The debt was not just a memory, it was a living part of him, a piece of his soul that he had left behind. He had to go back, he had to find them, he had to look them in the eyes and try, somehow, to repay the unpayable. Boarding the plane to Tokyo, Marcus Thorne felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since the war. He wasn't Lieutenant Thorne on a mission to destroy. He was just Marcus, a man on a mission to find the family who had risked everything for an enemy, the family who had taught him the true meaning of grace. Finding the village was harder than he could have imagined. Japan had transformed. New highways cut through landscapes he vaguely remembered, and towns had grown into small cities. But with the help of an old map and a persistent local guide, he finally found his way back to the remote valley. It was the same, yet completely different. Paved roads had replaced dirt paths, and new houses stood beside the old. His heart pounded as he walked toward the familiar bend in the road. And there it was, the farmhouse. It was older, the wood weathered to a silvery gray, but it was unmistakably the same house. A woman was in the garden, her back to him. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, but the way she moved, the set of her shoulders, he knew it was Hana. He called her name, his voice thick with emotion. "Hana-san?" She turned slowly, her eyes squinting against the sun. Confusion washed over her face, then a flicker of disbelief, and then a tidal wave of recognition that erased 30 years in an instant. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Makasu-san," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. The reunion was an explosion of emotion, a torrent of tears and laughter and words in a clumsy mix of Japanese and English. She called for her brother, Ken, who was now a middle-aged man with children of his own. He emerged from the house and stared, speechless, before breaking into a wide grin and embracing Marcus like a long-lost brother. The reunion was everything he had dreamed of. They sat and talked for hours, catching up on decades of lost time. He learned that Kenji had passed away peacefully a few years prior, having lived a long life. He met their families, the new generation that had grown up in a time of peace. It was a joyous, perfect homecoming. But as the day wore on, Marcus sensed a shadow behind their smiles, a lingering sadness. He finally asked the question that had been haunting him for years. "What happened after I left? Were you all okay?" Hana's smile faded. She looked at Ken, and a silent, pained understanding passed between them. It was time for the whole truth. She began to speak, her voice low and steady. After he was rescued, their secret did not die. The suspicious neighbor Saito, fueled by bitterness and a sense of being cheated of his patriotic discovery, never stopped talking. He spread the rumor throughout the village and the surrounding area. He couldn't prove it, but he didn't need to. In the shame and honor culture of post-war Japan, the accusation was as good as a conviction. The family was never arrested or officially punished by the authorities. They suffered a far crueler fate. They were subjected to murahachibu, a silent social ostracism. Neighbors stopped speaking to them. They were excluded from village meetings and festivals. Shopkeepers would serve them reluctantly. They became pariahs in their own home, branded as traitors who had helped the demon. Their act of supreme compassion had not been celebrated as a moment of humanity. It had been twisted into a mark of shame. They had been punished not for a few days or weeks, but for decades. Their children had been bullied at school. They had lived their entire lives under a cloud of disgrace, paying a daily price for the life they had saved. Marcus sat there, the joy of the reunion turning to ash in his mouth. He had returned to repay his debt, only to discover its true, horrifying extent. He had not been their salvation. He had been the beginning of their lifelong sentence. The cost of his life was not a few months of fear, but a lifetime of shame for the family that had shown him the meaning of love. Marcus Thorne hadn't just found the family that saved his life. He had found the devastating lifelong bill for his survival. Their story is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil, but a brutal testament that even the purest acts of compassion, especially in times of war, carry an impossibly heavy price. We want to thank you for joining us on this incredible and poignant journey. The story of Marcus, Kenji, and Hana is a powerful reminder of the complexities of the human heart that history often forgets. We are truly grateful that you chose to spend your time with us, exploring these important narratives. Their story forces us to ask a difficult question. What is true loyalty? Is it to a flag, a nation, or to the fundamental humanity that connects us all? Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Kenji and Hana's position. There is no right or wrong answer, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you believe stories like this need to be told, please help our channel grow by hitting that like button and, most importantly, subscribing so you won't miss our next deep dive into the hidden corners of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful human stories to light. Thank you once again for watching. We are honored to share these moments with you. Until the next story, take care and never stop questioning the official narratives.